Well, good afternoon from Ithaca, New York, home of Cornell University. My name is Nicholas Phillips, and I will be serving as your host and moderator today. Before we get started, just some quick housekeeping. We want you to know that we want our conversation to be as interactive as possible. So please submit your questions by opening the chat, and I promise we'll get to as many as we can. Now that we got that out of the way, I'm really excited for today's conversation. It's all about presidential predictions and how my guest was able to predict how the Electoral College would go for 49 of 50 states in 2020. Joining us in studio is Peter Enns, a professor of government and public policy and the Robert S. Harrison Director of the Cornell Center for Social Sciences. He's also the co-founder and chief data scientist at Verisight. Peter, thank you so much for joining us in studio. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
It's so great to have you. So my first question is, how do we get you a big board, like kind of Steve Kornacki? That's what I think your office is like.
Oh, yeah, you got to check it out. The interactive board, automatically updating. No. On election night, if anything, I'll probably go to bed early and wake up and see if we've got an outcome. So I think things will be mellow for me on election night. I hope.
That's good to know. So, kind of before we delve, into the actual predictions and everything like that, I'm hoping you can kind of give us a little bit of background. So what got you thinking about, kind of electoral college predictions, and what kind of, piqued your interest about looking at forecasts?
Yeah, sure. So this started before the 2020 election, and political scientists have a really good track record of forecasting election outcomes. And historically, the main ingredients, we might say, into their forecast is presidential approval, sort of, right? Does the public approve of the incumbent president and how the economy is doing? And these forecasts have worked really well, but they always use national presidential approval, national economy. Not always. That's been the approach. So one of my PhD students, Julius Lagodny, and I, we had been doing a lot of work taking national public opinion polls and using statistical modeling to make those national polls accurate at the state level. And so our thinking was, okay, if we can take national survey data, national public opinion polls, and through statistical modeling have accurate measures of state public opinion, we could take the standard political science forecasting model and bring it to the state level, which is super desirable because as we've learned, the popular vote winner doesn't necessarily translate to the winner of the election, which is due to the Electoral College. And so that's where this started. And that's what we basically had this idea. Let's use the methods we've been developing. Let's apply it to what other political scientists have done to forecasts, and let's see what happens.
And with that, generally, how long does it take to make the forecasts and predictions?
Yeah, I think it depends what you mean by that. And so, once all the coding's done and you hit run, it takes about 30 seconds. But to get all the data organized and ready, so we did this in 2020. And it was super successful, as you mentioned. And so then we thought, well, we should see how this holds up in 2024. So for 2024, for this forecast, we've been working about a year. And we brought two new individuals onto the team. So Julius, who was a PhD student, he's now head of data at El Pato, which is a data firm in Germany. So that's his full-time job. So he's been working on this on the side. And then Jonathan Kolner just finished his PhD, and now he's a data science assistant professor at NYU in New York City. And Anuja Kumar, she's a senior research associate at Yale University School of Medicine. So we basically have a team of four of us. None of it's our full-time job. I mean, for me, I'm a professor, I teach, and I do research, and this is one of my research areas. So the four of us have, in terms of getting the data, recoding the data, writing the scripts, our models include 70,000 simulations of potential outcomes. So getting all of that set up took us about a year.
Yeah, it takes a while, I could imagine. And, one of the things we talked about kind of before we went live here was, you publish it about 100 days out. So why 100 and not, say, a year out or so?
Yeah. Well, okay. The real answer I'll give you the truth. So when we did this for 2020, there's a journal, a political science academic journal called PS, Political Science and Politics, and they publish the major forecasts that political scientists put together. So we thought if we're doing this, we should submit it to that journal. So in 2020, to have it ready to send to that journal, we had to have the forecast done 100 days in advance.
Okay.
So, and that was, to be like, is a nice round number, you know, yeah, 100 days, let's see it. And so we submitted it. And so what's interesting, we didn't set out to every presidential election have a forecast. We were really thinking of, let's do this, let's try these methods. We've got this theoretical argument, let's see how it goes. Once we then said, okay, well, we're going to do it again for 2024, we wanted to change as little as possible. Because everything we change, then we don't know. If our forecast is less accurate, is it because we change our approach or because something else happened? So we've stuck with that. But the other thing that's nice about the 100 days, even though it was chosen by the due date of when we submitted it to this journal, that's, you know, so we're thinking over 3 months prior to the election, that really gives us a benchmark of what are our expectations before the final 3.5 months of the campaign kicks in. So there is, although it's just a nice round number that was a little bit arbitrary, it gives us this window into campaign effects. Because what we'll say is, you know, that in 2020, since we accurately forecasted 49 out of 50 states, that suggests there were very little minor campaign effects. Despite hundreds of millions of dollars in those final 3.5 months, we knew the outcome 100 days prior. So it gives us information. We learn about elections and how they work by these forecasts.
So is it safe to say, you know, based off the models, that 100 days, the campaigns didn't really kind of change the outcome as much? It's more kind of earlier on.
Yeah, well, and there's two views on this. One is the campaigns are sort of going against each other. And so if one wasn't there, the other would get an advantage. So they're sort of just keeping, you know, they're sort of like, imagine like a tug of war, and sort of they're moving back and forth, but they're just sort of equal effort, and they end up about where they would have been. So that's one view. Another view in political science is the voters are learning about the candidates, about the issues. And so it takes the campaign for them to get the information about, and I don't really believe that so much. I think most voters have a pretty good sense of how the economy is doing, how it's affecting their lives. And most voters in this day and age know whether they like the incumbent president or not. And so, yeah, I think I'm kind of in the minimal effects camp of how much campaigns influence the outcome.
And you mentioned kind of a little bit some of the characteristics you use. So, you know, presidential approval rating, turning that down to the state level. So I'm interested to know, what are some of the factors that you use to kind of help you predict essentially all of the states?
Yeah. So we're looking at each state, how much they approve of the president. So in this case, we started with how much they approve of Biden. And then to do that you could think of as a somewhat complicated statistical model that's pulling in additional information for us to get that state level result. And then we're looking at the economy, and what we want is a measure that's kind of the broadest possible measure of economic conditions in each state. And so what we use is the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia publishes what they call state coincident indexes. And so this is an indicator of 4 different economic measures at the state level. So think of unemployment, hours worked, manufacturing, salary, wages, and that's adjusted for inflation. So it's kind of a big picture index of how the economy is doing. So we take that. Then there's one additional step we have to make, because voters, we know, weigh the current economic conditions more heavily than economic conditions a year ago or at the start of the presidency, right? So it's how the economy's doing, but more how it's doing today affects me more than how it was doing 2 years ago. So we then make some adjustments. So we have monthly data throughout the entire presidency, so in this case, Biden's presidency, but we're statistically adjusting this monthly economic data. So we end our last data point's June, so last June. June is weighted more heavily than the first month of Biden's presidency. So we make that statistical adjustment.
That's so interesting. And you mentioned it before, but we got 49 out of the 50 states. My apologies. What was the one state you missed?
Okay, so we missed Georgia.
Okay, I remember Georgia vividly in that election cycle. But any reason why Georgia was missed?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know for sure. I mean, I can give a couple thoughts on this. If we think back to 2020, Stacey Abrams made a lot of efforts and, inspired, there were articles at the time how she inspired, historic registration and turnout in Georgia among Democrats. So one story is kind of turnout efforts, motivation, boots on the ground is what shifted Georgia to deviate from what our forecast is. In other words, if those efforts hadn't happened, Georgia would have gone the other way. But, in full transparency, we missed North Carolina by the same amount, by about just 3 percentage points. So these are like small errors.
Wow.
But North Carolina, Biden barely lost.
Yeah.
So Biden got 49.3% of the vote in North Carolina. So we got North Carolina right. We got Georgia wrong. But it was these, like our statistical error was identical on both of those. So that raises this really interesting question. Is it really a turnout story in Georgia, or is it just the statistical model? Of course, there's going to be errors and imperfections, and that's the one we missed.
And I'd be interested to know what does that say about the models that it was such a small percentage. It wasn't 4 or 5 data points, but I think you mentioned maybe about 1 or 2.
Yeah,
3.
yeah. I mean, one piece is it really highlights how close presidential elections are in the United States in this era, and they come down to a handful of states and incredibly close margins in those states. The other thing it highlights is the models, like what we're doing, can get really quite accurate, very close. But if you're 1 or 2 percentage points off directionally, and what I mean by that is we might predict one candidate, that candidate might lose. And so directionally we were off. We made the wrong prediction about who won that state. Percentage-wise, we might have been within 1 percentage point or less of the actual outcome. And so it's just very, very tricky process.
And Chris checks in with an interesting question. So we had talked about, kind of finishing the model 100 days out. Chris just wanted to know, will you rerun the forecast closer to the election to see if it changes?
Yeah, we haven't done that. And the main reason is that all the data we have is set from the 100 days out. And so we're not able to get, so for example, I mentioned the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. They always post their data with a lag. So we won't we could get slightly updated economic data, but not right before. And the presidential approval data we're collecting in order to estimate the state level presidential approval, that we don't have a source to get right up on election day. So we kind of stick with this, say what can we learn from it, and it's a great question, because the forecast you'd get in the major news. So if you think about 538, The Economist has a forecast, Nate Silver, they're updating their forecast every single day. Every new poll, every new result, they're updating. They also have a team of, it's a full-time job, and they have a team of, a large staff. And so, we're kind of one shot, see what we can learn.
Yeah, I'm thinking about watching all the news coverage and hundreds of people in the back room. It's really wild. One thing is, you had talked about kind of the different models, kind of 538. How does your model compare to other ones that were done?
Yeah, I think the main difference is we talk about, we often call it the horse race polls. So this is if the election was today, who would you vote for? And then we see, okay, is Harris ahead now or is Trump ahead? So we call those horse races because often they're like back and forth.
Yeah.
And so they're taking those vote intentions from the horse race polls and updating their model based on that. And it's a really sensible approach. This is what the public's saying, who they would vote for if the election was today. Our approach is totally different because we have no data about vote intentions. It's just, do you approve of the president? And we do make an adjustment when Harris entered the race. So we have an adjustment for Harris entering the race, but it's a very different sort of theoretical take. We're saying we're going to be able to gauge vote based on how you feel about the incumbent president, and we're not going to ask directly who you're going to say you're going to vote for.
Okay. And just real quick, so, when I think of, presidential approval rating, obviously I think of, kind of what the public thinks as far as how the president is doing in their job. Is there a vice presidential approval rating as well?
There is. It's not asked as much, but that's a great question because that's what we use for the adjustment. And so we have a lot of data on Biden's approval rating because this almost every survey that's run is asking that question. But we found we were able to get 5 surveys that asked, do you approve or disapprove of how Biden's handling his job as president? And it also asked, do you approve or disapprove of how Harris is handling her job as vice president? So now we have the same survey, the same type of question, asking approval, so we can calculate the difference. And Harris's approval ratings were higher than Biden's in all 5 of these surveys.
Oh, wow.
So we take the average difference and then make that adjustment. And so that lets us see Harris's effect on the forecast relative to Biden, which makes a big difference.
Yeah. And just for clarity, what goes into the presidential approval rating? I'm assuming there's a bunch of factors that go into it. It's not just, do you think the president's doing well or not?
So the wording of the survey question is the simple way. It's literally, do you approve or disapprove of how the president is handling his job as president? If it's always been a man to date. So his job as president. Now, psychologically, the survey respondent, how are they answering?
Yeah,
that's we don't know, but you could imagine some people say really familiar with policies, and I either approve of them or I don't. Some people, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, I'm an independent. So for us, it's this global measure of what the public's thinking about the current administration.
That's so interesting. And Robert checks in and he just wants to know, given there is no incumbent, what indicators are used?
Yeah, and so that's coming from this adjustment for Harris. And so so the economic conditions, our model is treating the same. So if you like how the economy is doing, we're going to forecast more likely to vote Democrat. And if you don't like how the economy is doing, more likely to want to change and vote Republican. But that shift, adding the additional approval that Harris has in those polls, is what's making that adjustment.
And without getting kind of too into the weeds here, how do you figure out the presidential approval rating based off of state? So I would assume, a deep blue state like New York would have a presidential approval rating be very, very high versus in Alabama or something. They might have it be low. How do you figure out kind of the different states and their individual approval ratings?
Yeah. I think you said don't go too deep, but I'll try to not get too far in the weeds here. Yeah. But so we gather as many polls, and so we're doing this 100 days in advance. So essentially June and July, last June and July, get as many polls as we can get. And so we end up, Verisight, you mentioned my affiliation with Verisight, so we conducted some polls. We also got polls from AP, NORC, so Associated Press polls at NORC at the University of Chicago, conducted Gallup, some Gallup data, and Brightline Watch is a survey. So we get all of these data and we combine it. So a typical survey has about 1,000 respondents, a national survey. And believe it or not, 1,000 survey respondents gives really good estimates of national public opinion.
Okay.
I won't go into the statistics of that unless you push me there. But so we've got these surveys, we combine them. So now we have well over 10,000 respondents. And so that's where we run the statistical model that essentially what other factors, race, gender, age, education level, state, region of the country, this large statistical model to see what predicts presidential approval. So once we know that, then we can reweight the data, all 10 to 15,000 data points, to match the population of each state. So we've taken multiple surveys, aggregate into a massive survey, think of that as a mega poll, run a complex statistical model to understand what affects presidential approval, use that model and census data so to reweight all the data to match state populations, and we end up with a valid and reliable measure of each state's presidential approval rating.
And you talked a little bit about this before when we just started, but I'd be interested to know, why is it so important to focus on the state data versus, kind of national polling? Like you mentioned, obviously the president isn't elected by the popular vote; it's the electoral
Yeah,
college.
yeah. So that's exactly right, and we know DC is incredibly democratic.
Okay.
And we know New York's pretty democratic. These states, you don't need a PhD in political science to have a really good guess at which way their vote's going to go. And so this helps us get a better indication of the so-called swing states, which are much closer, evenly 50-50, and we don't know. We need the data to give us indicators of which way the swing states are leaning. And this is also interesting because this is where the campaigns spend most of their time and money, because they know the outcomes in the states that have voted in a certain way for the past, multiple election cycles. And so this is giving us insight into not just each state, but the states that we're most uncertain about.
Okay. And I'd be interested to know how the economic data contributes to this. So I'm thinking about, a large state like California. Their economy is obviously going to be very different than a Georgia economy or a South Carolina economy. So how does that kind of affect this?
Well, and that really reinforces why it's so important to look at the states, because you could imagine the overall national economy is doing okay, and one state's doing much better. Maybe manufacturing's gone into that state, or maybe manufacturing's left that state and that state's doing worse. So we can capture those nuances, and sort of underlying our sort of the theory of the forecast is state economic conditions are going to be more important to voters than the national economic conditions. Meaning if I'm going to vote and I'm trying to decide, so let's say I'm an independent and I'm saying, well, I heard some things Harris was saying, heard some things Trump was saying, I'm trying to make up my mind. And there aren't that many folks like that these days. Most folks are in a partisan camp, they're Democrat or Republican. But imagine you're a swing voter in a swing state.
Okay.
Well, if somebody's telling you how the economy is at the national level, the national unemployment rate probably means a lot less than the state. And we'd love it if we had even smaller geographic regions. Imagine if we had county level unemployment, county level wages, and so forth. We don't have that data. State's the most fine-grained geographical data we have for the economy right now.
And would that I'm assuming that would help the forecast even more if you had, like county data or I guess regional data.
Yeah. In theory, what you would do is make separate predictions for each county. Then each county's population size. So you would make an adjustment. It's kind of a weighted average, bring it all together for the state.
And just to kind of tie everything back, so does the economic statistics affect the approval rating for the state?
That's a good question, right? Because absolutely, economic conditions do affect presidential approval. So we're saying there's overlap in what it matters, but presidential approval adds additional information. So it's not just the economy. And it used to be that economic conditions mattered more for presidential approval than today. And what I mean by that is you can track presidential approval over time. So, for example, the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research is a data archive, public opinion data archive at Cornell, world's largest archive. That's where we get most of the historical data in the model. They show presidential approval over time. And it used to be as the economy got better, presidential approval went up. As the economy got worse, presidential approval went down. And you could see this really tight, close relationship. Now people are more locked in. So Biden's approval has been pretty flat, regardless of economic changes. And so it just feels like political evaluations of the president are much more kind of either approve or disapprove. And economic conditions matter a little bit for that, but it's not nearly as influential as it has been historically.
And kind of looking over the numbers, do you see big swings as far as, kind of presidential approval ratings go, kind of state by state?
Yeah, for sure. The states we think of as more liberal definitely approve of Biden higher, and the states we think of as more conservative much less. Yeah, for sure.
That's very good to know. And David just wanted to know kind of how stable is your data. That is, how often would a person give the same response kind of week after week?
Yeah, yeah. So we haven't looked at that directly where we re-interview the exact same people.
Oh, okay.
But in other research context, I've looked at that, and it's quite stable. Meaning, someone who says they approve of the president 3 months later, they tend to say they still approve of the president. Where you might get shifts is strongly approved to somewhat approved back to strongly approved. It's the same thing when you ask after an election. If you ask early in election who you plan to vote for, so early in the campaign, and then after the election, who did you vote for? You get a lot of consistency. It's just, I think that's a reflection of how partisan politics are, and there's much more stability in political attitudes and behaviors now than even 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Oh, wow. And do you think, obviously, using your model with the states gives a more kind of accurate description of the electorate? So, everybody always talks about, how kind of 2020 the polls were off. So do you think your forecast provides like a little bit more clarity for that?
Yeah, I think so. And the way we looked at that in 2020, we have this forecast of the percent vote outcome in each state. And then we can average that together. It's got to be what I'd call a weighted average because there's more people in California than in Vermont or New Hampshire. So we've got to make these population adjustments. But if we do the weighted average, meaning taking the population size of each state, we can combine our forecast for each state and get an estimate of the popular vote. So our popular vote estimate was 2 percentage points off in 2020, which we thought was really close. And to give an indication of how close that was, one of the most important election studies is the American National Election Study. So this is a massive study, more than 8,000 people. They do face-to-face interviews. So it's this incredibly expensive, multi-million-dollar survey funded by the National Science Foundation. And so they started their data collection after our forecast. So basically think of the last 2 months of the campaign. They're interviewing in the highest quality, most rigorous way possible, over 8,000 people. Their error was identical to ours, 2 percentage points.
Oh, wow.
So our model got made the exact same forecast of the overall U.S. popular vote as the American National Election Study, even though all of their data was collected closer to the election and they were directly interviewing the public.
Wow, that's amazing. And Chris wanted to follow up just very quick. Chris said, given the vibe of the economy based on feeling rather than facts, do you think that will affect your model at all?
Yeah, that's really interesting. If it's not the fact, because we're using an objective measure, right? This is the Federal Reserve, and so if essentially the way I look at it is, the way we make the forecast is we're looking at historical data and historical relationships. So if historically it was what we might call objective economic indicators mattered for vote choice, and then 2024, it's sort of gone to feelings, not the objective economy. Like that would be a source of error in our model because the way these variables worked historically aren't working the same. So in some ways we'll find out. But I think the presidential approval is kind of getting at the feelings too. So the model's tapping into both how much you approve of the incumbent president and the objective economic indicators. So my best guess is it's still the model will work as it has historically, but we won't know till after the election.
And with your model, was it more Democrat response, more Republican response, or like a nice mix?
Yeah, so the public opinion data is very representative of the public as a whole, and that that's really, really important. Now, when you look at any one individual poll, sometimes sometimes you get slight leanings one way or the other.
Cool. Okay, that's good to know. And one thing is, when we look at the models as far as kind of approval variables go, how do shifts in public opinion about maybe the sitting president maybe influence some of the metrics?
Yeah, it's essentially, I would say, Well, are you thinking about that, like sort of how that translates into the actual forecast we make?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the key here is what I think the most specific answer to that is, as you would guess, higher approval for a Democratic incumbent is going to correspond to a higher Democratic vote. But sort of how do we know the exact amount, right?
Yeah.
Sort of how do we know? And that's where the model is built based on our election data from 1980 through. So 2024's model is based on data from 1980 through 2020. So that data combines to give us the statistical relationship between presidential approval and each state's vote and economic conditions and each state's vote historically. So now we know like the exact statistical relationship of all those elections together.
Oh, wow.
So that gives us what you might think of as the relationship is to get a little bit mathematical or geeky, is like the slope parameter, right? So as presidential approval becomes more democratic, we would expect a more democratic vote share.
Yeah.
And so that slope parameter is what lets us make the forecast. So we say, okay, we know what this state's presidential approval is. We know what the estimated relationship is historically. Let's just plot that on the slope parameter, and that gives us our prediction. So we're using all that historical data to quantify the relationships, and that quantified relationship is what we plug into 2024 data to get each state's specific forecast.
And I can't speak highly enough about the forecast. And with that, one thing I wanted to know was, back in 2020, the guy who runs 538, the online prediction, mentioned that your forecast nailed it. So just could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was awesome, an awesome validation. Yeah, so that was G. Elliott Morris. So at the time, he was running the forecast for The Economist.
Okay.
And then a year or two ago, he was hired to run 538's forecast. 538 was started by Nate Silver, who's very prominent in the forecast business. And so, yeah, essentially, this is somebody who does this essentially professionally. And so, when he said our model nailed it, that was that was a great feeling.
And I'd be interested to know, when it comes to kind of some of your factors in your models, how do swing states play into that?
Yeah. Besides creating a headache because they're the hardest to forecast. And I should say, we speak. Of course, since we got 49 out of 50 states accurate, I love that when that statistic's mentioned. But our forecast includes uncertainty around the estimates. Like we know there's error in the model. We know even the best economic measures, even with all our statistical modeling of state presidential approval, like we can't get it perfect.
Yeah, I can't.
So we know there's error. We do our best to quantify the error. And that's where the 70,000 simulations are trying to mathematically incorporate the error. And that essentially gives us a distribution of expected outcomes. So the middle, like the average of that distribution, that's our forecast for each state. But the range of the distribution gives us the uncertainty or the likely error. And so for the swing states, it can be the case where we can say our forecast says, for example, which way Michigan's leaning or which way Wisconsin's leaning. But the error can be like the known uncertainties around the estimates can overlap both sides. And so it could go either way. And that's kind of the definition of a swing state.
And we had mentioned, presidential approval rating, obviously, in, New York, obviously, is going to be very high for Biden. Does that change when it comes to swing states? So I'm thinking like swing states, because they're, so up in the air. Pennsylvania could, say 1 month go for Biden, the next month go for Trump or Harris or however. Does that change much at all?
I would say it's the results are relatively stable month to month.
Okay.
But the approval ratings are lower because the state has more of a balance of Democrats and Republicans, which is why it's the swing state. And the other thing, for sure, more democratically leaning states like New York or Massachusetts have higher Biden approval ratings. But Biden's approval ratings have been pretty low, like kind of historically low. And so the public across the board is not rating Biden as president that very high. Interestingly, after he dropped out, his approval ratings went up.
Oh,
And that probably suggests that some Democrats were kind of thinking he should drop out. And so once he dropped out, it's like, oh, he's been doing an okay job. I just thought he was running. I mean, I don't have direct data on that, but the positive bump in his approval ratings are consistent with that narrative.
That's so interesting. Do we see that happen ever? Like, when a president leaves office, or obviously in Biden's case steps down, their approval rating go up, or is it like pretty steady after they leave office?
Yeah, and usually it's not continued to be asked. So it's this interesting case where he dropped out of the election, but he's still in office. So we're still asking that presidential approval question. And so we get to see that effect where normally like we don't have data because someone drops, the election's over. And you get, obviously there's still president for the next, until the end of the year, until the inauguration. But yeah, I think we don't usually have this much data, but I think this is a pretty unique scenario.
That's so interesting. I love it. And YW checked in with a question. They wanted to know, how do you ensure your survey collects a representative sample? I've heard Democratic-leaning voters were slightly overrepresented in polls in 2020. I've also read about distrust in institutions. Under 40% of people have a strong trust in universities. Does that matter? It's a very broad question.
Yeah, no, and that's a terrific question. That's absolutely accurate. So, meaning it's hard to ensure a representative sample, and we do see across surveys, usually Democrats are at the margins. So in other words, in small percentages, are slightly more likely to take surveys. So you can if there is a systematic bias in recent elections, it's been pro-democratic. Then how do we deal with that? So one, we could, I know the methods of Verisight surveys very well because I'm a co-founder of the company. So our approach is to reach members of the public in as many different ways as possible. So the historical strategy of surveys was you take a random sample, you pick your mode. So when it was random digit dialing, you'd call people up. Then it's like, okay, well, let's call people on their landline and their cell phone. Now we're in a world where we kind of don't answer our cell phones if we don't know the number, right? So you can't rely on that. So we do, we reach people through different social media platforms, through different websites, through different advertisements. We also send out mailers. We reach some people through mailers. So think of like this broad as outreach as possible. And the idea is the broader outreach as possible, the more representative we'll get. And then we see who's taking the surveys so we can make adjustments. And so we can constantly recalibrate. So that's the Verisight approach. But then for the forecast, we bring in Gallup data. Gallup's a reputable organization, and they still use the phone call method. So they're using they're using the old school, very expensive random digit dial cell phone. The Associated Press NORC poll, they're using what they call the Amerispeak panel. So this is a very, very large group of folks who are all selected in a rigorous way to take surveys. And then the Bright Lion Watch survey is using a company called YouGov. So we start with the Verisight approach, which is designed to get as broad and accurate and representative sample as you can. And then bring in these other surveys that are each using their own methods, pull it together. That gives us a lot of confidence that we've got this mega poll that is fully representative of the public.
That's so amazing. And one thing I just thought about now is with your forecast, are certain swing states easier to predict or harder to predict? So before we started, we were talking about, Florida in 2000. Wow, it feels like forever ago. But are certain states easier to predict versus others when it comes to swing states?
Yeah, well, and some shift. So Florida's gotten more Republican. So it's in that sense, it should be easier because it's less of a swing state. I would also say state size matters where you have a more populous state. Even with all the public opinion methods I described, it's going to be harder for us to get state level estimates of presidential approval in a very tiny populous state. So think of it, Delaware, which isn't a swing state, but Delaware versus California, right? It's going to be a little harder. But really, when we got, I think in 2023 states and about 90,000 votes total determined the election. When we're that close, it's
Yeah,
just gonna be
that's
like, there's an element of luck and coincidence into any forecast at that point.
And what were some surprises or maybe some, on anomalies in your forecast when you kind of compared it to the election results?
Yeah. Well, in 2020, the biggest surprise was we only missed one state, to be honest.
Yeah.
And because we didn't come at this as like my core research area is public opinion and data science, and I've done work in other areas, but I hadn't ever thought of myself as a forecaster. So we really said, well, we know what political scientists have done successfully. We've done research that allows an innovation. Let's try it. And like it should work. It's based on methods that are relevant and theoretical arguments, but we didn't know. So I would say, yeah, the biggest surprise was how accurate it turned out to be. We expected it to be accurate, but we didn't know.
Yeah, and I figured I'd get this question, but David wants to know, so does your model predict who will win?
Yeah, it predicts who will win. No, I don't mean that. This is for David. I don't mean that like I know who will win. We have a prediction. So should I talk about that?
Yes,
okay.
please.
So keep in mind, this is 100 days prior to the election. And so what we're thinking about is if we look at approval of Biden 100 days out, and then we adjust for how much more popular Harris was than Biden 100 days out, and we adjust and we look at economic conditions 100 days out, that says so I'll start with the popular vote.
Okay.
The popular vote is nearly evenly split.
Oh, wow.
It's from the forecast model. Again, there's uncertainty around these estimates, but the precise forecast is 50.3% popular vote Trump, edging out Harris 49.7%.
Oh, wow.
But again, with the statistical uncertainty, that's a tie, 50-50, essentially popular vote. But the electoral college, as we've been talking about, is different. So the model 100 days out is toward Trump. And when we look at those 70,000 simulations, Trump has just, according to the model, just under a 3 in 4 chance of winning the election. Winning the electoral college. So split popular vote with anything, just a minuscule edge toward Trump and a notable electoral college edge toward Trump 100 days out.
That's interesting. Was there, I guess, a state to put him over the top? Just interested to know.
Yeah. No, let me pull that up so I can get this accurate for you. So essentially, what if we think about it, what states pull them over the top, and what we want to keep in mind, there's really, this sort of speaks to the strategy of where should Trump focus, where should Harris focus. So Michigan, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And so of those 4 states, which are leaning Trump, if Trump wins any 2 of those 4, he wins the election, according to our model. Another path would be Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania has a high number of electoral college votes in that group. So Pennsylvania and Nevada, which is also leaning Trump, would give him the election, according to our model. So again, keep in mind, this is all data from 100 days out, and there's been a lot of changes in the campaign. But those seem to be the key states. Those would be the swing states, and that's where both candidates, if they're reading our forecast, should be spending their time and money.
And we talked a little bit about it before, but obviously this election cycle is very different. With Biden stepping down and everything like that. So how does one, Kamala Harris becoming the nominee, and 2, with her becoming the nominee so close to the election, how does that kind of affect the model?
Yeah. Well, and another way to sort of reframe that is, the model actually tells us about why that happened. And so because we have the model, we first ran the model without any adjustment for Harris's popularity, so just with Biden approval. And so if you think back to the time, Biden at the debate, a lot of folks said Biden did not have a great debate performance. Some people said he had a very bad debate performance. And then there starts to be some rumblings, should he drop out? And Biden writes this letter to Congress and, the Democratic Party, I'm in this race, I'm going to win it, there's not a chance. 2 weeks later, it's like, I'm out, you know? And so there's all this, what happened? Was it the debate? There was some talk, Nancy Pelosi met with him. Okay, what did she say? So our forecast said if Biden had stayed in the race, he would have had a less than 1 in 10 chance at winning.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
the approval ratings and economic conditions worked against him in a major way.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, Nancy Pelosi did not have our forecast, but if she did, like,
Yeah,
if she would have showed that to him, like, that was kind of like, this isn't going to work. It's just such a, and again, it's the approval rating. And the other thing to think about, economic conditions under Biden, of course, Democrats and Republicans in the public often have different views. But if we step back objectively, post-COVID, the economic recovery has been very strong. Most of those gains were in the early part of Biden's presidency. So recall, our forecast weights the later quarters more heavily because that's what we expect voters to be paying attention to. So once we look at the economy from that perspective of what we think voters are going to key in on, it's kind of a middling economy historically. It's not a great economy if we think about the last 40 years. It's about in the middle. And his approval ratings on the low end. And that translates into a less than 1 in 10 chance of Biden winning. So then at Harris, so we think that explains, like, the Democratic Party knew, like, there just wasn't a solid path. So then Harris enters, and it now changes to just over 1 in 4 chance. So it's not a great opportunity for the Democrats, but would you rather be running at less than 1 in 10 chance, or would you rather be running at just over 1 in 4? So it's a big major shift.
True. And, you know, kind of looking ahead, do you foresee any adjustments or improvements on your model that maybe might take into account, you know, kind of new economic situations or anything like that?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing we really, well, one question is, okay, let's go through 2024 and then see if we're going to put the effort in it in 4 years. But let's say we do, how these variables relate to each other over time is kind of an interesting question. And I'll give one example. In 2020, we had a variable in the model that just indicated, is it a state from the South or not? Because historically, even knowing how states voted in the past, in the previous election, states that were Southern still were more likely to vote Republican. So that variable kind of accounted for that shift. We started looking at the data. That effect's no longer there. So that was based on the early years of our data, and it's no longer there. So we had to make this decision, and we said, if we have no statistical evidence that that Southern states, on top of knowing last election's vote, are more likely to go Republican, that shouldn't be in the model. So we took that out. And there, you know, I can send you the article with the 20-page appendix, and you can see all the statistical analyses that validate that decision. But that's kind of an interesting question for when do factors that mattered historically change, and how do you find a set of decision criteria for making those changes, because you want to be as true to the historical model as possible, but you don't want to be so true that you ignore actual real changes that matter. So, and we try to sort that out through statistical analyses.
And with that statistical analysis, are there any factors or characteristics that you wish you had? I know you mentioned before how the economy is doing, or unemployment based off of like county and not just broadly statewide. Are there some characteristics or statistics that you wish you had?
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I think, you know, more data is always better as long as it's good, high quality data. Smaller geographic regions, and then Chris Vlejan and Bob Erickson have done a forecast at the national level. And instead of these coincident economic indicators, so the current economic indicators, they use data that the Fed puts out for leading economic indicators. So this is essentially the Federal Reserve's data collection, best guess at where the economy is going.
Oh, okay.
COVID was so disruptive in terms of the economy and data collection that they no longer collect leading economic indicators at the state level. So in 2020, we didn't have it. I wondered, would it come back? It still hasn't come back. So there are economic measures called leading economic measures at the national level that I would love to get at the state level. They just no longer exist because of the disruptions COVID caused.
And before we wrap, you had mentioned, I believe, your forecast had Trump at, I think it was 50.3, Harris at 49.7,
Yep.
I believe. So broadly speaking, what does that say about the model as far as being only, 0.6 percentage points off?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it says more about how split the electorate is. And so if the model's right, and again, thinking 100 days out, if that's where the electorate is, it just shows how evenly split in terms of Democrat, Republican vote. It also gives us a pretty big indication of how the Electoral College can give a different, set of results than the popular vote. Here, they're going in the same direction, but what looks like an equally split popular vote looks like a Trump advantage in the Electoral College.
And when the returns come, is there any metric that you're excited to look at or, interested to see?
Yeah. So like in terms of the election outcome. Yeah. So here's the way I think about it. Well, what I want to see how we did, right? How did we do? But I think where I said earlier that 2020 was evidence that the final months of the campaign didn't seem to shift things hardly at all because we got 49 out of 50 states. This to me is a campaign that could be most likely to have effects. And so by having this forecast from 100 days out, we can observe that. We won't know exactly what's going on, but if Harris wins, it'll really say one or two things in my mind. It'll either say she brought energy and enthusiasm to the Democratic Party that was had such a high impact. It went from the incumbent president dropping out because approval and the economy was so bad he dropped out, that she overcame that, right? And or that Trump and the Republican Party, if Harris wins, will have squandered a really substantial lead. And you can read news articles where it's off the record comments of concerns from the Republican Party that Trump's not sticking to his message, that he's not, following the campaign, the recommendations of the campaign advisors. There's also been concerns among the Republican Party of the choice of J.D. Vance. So if we look at public opinion data, J.D. Vance is the least popular vice presidential choice. Like if we look at like popularity ratings of past vice presidential candidates, he's the lowest. And so this raises a question. If our forecast is wrong, that'll be a strong suggestion that the final months of the campaign mattered. And it's either a story of Trump squandering a lead, Harris overcoming massively disadvantageous conditions, or both.
That's so awesome. I love it. I could talk for hours about this, but Peter, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I love looking at the models and hearing from you. Audience, thank you so much for staying with us and for all your questions. We really appreciate it. Before we go, one last thing, just let us know kind of how we did. There should be a QR code at the top of the player there, and just kind of give us some feedback, and we do look at your responses, and we really appreciate it. Again, Peter, thank you so much. Audience, thank you so much for staying with us, and we'll see you at the next keynote. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Appreciate it.